Welcome back to What God Has Done With My Pain. On today's episode, we're going to do something a little bit different. So staying on theme of what God has done with our pain, but this episode, we're going to jump into a more biblical aspect of it. We're going to take a true story from the Bible. I said Bible. I don't know where that was coming from.
Bible from an American Story.
Yes. And the goal with this is to maintain God's character and kind of take a step back and see that he is consistent through all of it. What better way than to actually grab a text that was written over years and years and years ago, but that is true. A lot of the times when it comes to picking up a Bible or even looking at a Bible, it can be very overwhelming, especially for me when I first started. One of the main issues I had was that I thought it was more of like a rule book or a guideline of the things that was expected of me as, a follower of Christ. And now being further along in my relationship with God, I've come to find that it's actually a storybook, a poetry book, a song book, just even like a history book and keeping genealogy and all of those things. So when you look at it from the perspective of this is a storybook of real characters, real people who went through real trauma, real pain, and how God was able to use that in their lives. And also, they didn't know that they were playing in a bigger picture. They didn't realize that there were going to be people years and years and years and years and years later who would be reading their story. And so the goal with this is to make reading the Bible a little bit more comfortable. And what better way than to break down a chapter? And I'm not saying like break it down like a professor would do it, but more breaking it down to simplify it a little bit more. Because if you're anything like me, when you read the Bible, you can get lost in the sauce. Like there are things that you're like, wait, I don't understand what that means, or why did God do that, or why did that character do that? And if we can just focus on this is a story and these are real people, this happened to real people. And I mean, yeah, we're believers. We have to stop looking at the Bible as something fictional and just something to reference to every now and again, but actually remember that this actually happened and maintaining the truth behind that, and not to water it down, but also to better understand it and also bring people closer to reading the Bible and from a perspective of it's not a rule book. It's not going to tell you that you're a horrible person. It's not going to say that you're doing everything wrong. Quite the opposite. It's going to show you that there were people in the past who have actually endured and like have struggled with real life struggles. And wait until we wait until we go over David, because I remember my jaw dropped when I read David's story. But we'll get that's a story for another time. Today we're going to be actually going over Job, the story of Job, because his is known widely about his suffering and about his struggle and everything he went through. And so it's a perfect place to start. And so this podcast, of course, will still have interviews in it. That's the main goal with my podcast, is to interview people and see how God showed up in their lives individually and how he performed in ways only God can perform. But every now and again, there's going to be an episode where we break down a book of the Bible and we just talk about how God showed up in that book and biblically how that works, so that when you pick up your Bible and you look into it, it'll be a softer view of it. You'll read it and be like, oh my gosh, like this makes so much sense now, because it's not
stories about people.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that packed. So if you didn't notice by now, Martin is joining me.
Yeah, I was trying not to talk too much because I feel like they wouldn't know who I am.
I know I hadn't introduced you yet. But those closest to me know exactly who you are. But yes, this is Martin Brown. Martin actually has played a really huge part in my growth with the Bible, because he actually is the one who told me, like, have you tried reading it from the perspective of like a storybook? Like, this is real life people and these are characters who struggled. And it wasn't until he actually told me that. And actually, I think one of the stories he first helped me read was like Esther. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if I could interject too, like even beyond just saying like these are true stories, like there are several different kinds of books in the Bible too. And if it's not apparent to people listening already, like I studied literature in school. I studied writing, specifically composition. And so I think something that gets lost a lot when we look at the Bible, because of how, like, the sort of weighty position that it holds in our culture and our society. Like, it's the book that you get forced to read, I think, is how a lot of people see it.
Yeah.
And somewhere in all of that, it stops being a book. Like, we no longer think of it like someone wrote this.
Yeah.
And to me, that's a big deal because, like, what I studied is called rhetoric. And that's basically just the study of, like, how you use words to accomplish things. Like, am I trying to convince someone of something? Am I trying to, like, make someone see the beauty of something? Am I, like, what is my goal and how do I accomplish it with words?
I think for me, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I think for me, at least, growing up, I viewed the Bible as, this is where the 10 Commandments came from. And this is where we got the idea of what is sinful and what is not, and like the expectation set up. And it was hard for me to pick up the Bible because I was like, well, I don't know if I want to find out anymore.
Yeah. You don't see it as a thing that has, like, art to it, really, or like life. But when it was written, it was like each individual part for the time that it was written, it was very artful. Like Job, that we're going to be talking about today, was literally poetry. It was like sort of like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah.
If people are familiar with that, that's epic poetry. So it's telling a story and it's historical, but it has embellishments and it has artistry to it. And it is intentionally, like, artful. It's trying to be beautiful. And I think that's something we don't think about with this, but there's some beautiful, like, intentionality in that. Yeah,
I absolutely agree. There's so many great stories in the Bible that I look forward to piecing into an episode and kind of softening it for a lot of listeners. And again, like, this is just to make it easier to even think about the Bible and all of that great stuff. So kind of jumping into that. So for those of you that don't know about the book of Job, there's a lot. Realistically, there's so much that's in this book. I mean, it's beautifully written and every verse is so powerful. But for, of course, the goal of this episode, we're going to try to simplify it as much as possible and make it readable and also relatable. And there are going to be things that are going to be hard to understand, even like theologians now, have some things that they probably are like, and we'll never know the answer to that. And that's absolutely okay. God's character is a hard character to pin because, he created the heaven and the earth. So I think there's that's a whole character that our minds can't possibly wrap around it. So jumping into that, the beginning of the book of Job talks about, how would you describe the beginning of Job?
It's a bit like the start of a fairy tale, I would say. It essentially, so it tells us where he lives, which is the land of Uz, U-Z, kind of like Oz. Yeah. And that, for context, is a place that was very far away from Israel. So it's essentially saying there was a man once in this far off place, long ago and far, far away. Like, it's sort of a...
Yeah, and it describes...
To me, that's like a fairy tale opening almost. And it's sort of just setting the scene of this guy who's very prosperous and has a good time of life, basically. It talks about how many children he has, 10, I believe, 7 sons and 3 daughters.
Yeah, and the main thing, too, is that in the Bible, it describes Job's character as blameless, righteous, and always honoring God. He's known for, he's literally known as a godly man. Like, the
Even
example.
Though he lives so far from Israel, he still fears the God of Israel.
Yeah, and so... Yeah, exactly. Like in the Bible, when he's being described, it's talked as he is a godly man who does sacrifices, does no wrong in the eyes of God. And in the later in the book of Job, you come to find out that God is actually holding like a council meeting. I think there was like an exact word for it. If you hear my papers
holding
scrumbling.
council, I believe.
Oh, it's called heavenly command is what it starts with. So it starts so it starts with the heavenly command.
Yeah,
They're having
the
like
host of heavens was
Yeah.
a term that they used a lot to refer basically to God with the image of a king.
Yeah.
How a king would have their advisors and people who ruled over smaller areas would come before the king and speak, and they would hold court. And that's essentially how it's described.
Yes, I believe it's heavenly creatures called sons of God. I think that's how the Bible Project referred to it. But yes. So he's having like a council meeting. He's just talking with everyone. And he's talking about Job, basically. He's like, I have this incredible son on earth. He is blameless. He is righteous. He honors me, and he is highly favored in my eyes. Like I hold a very special place for him in my heart. And this is where the story gets very interesting. This is where I remember I was like, question mark, because in that moment when God is talking about Job, about what an incredible son he is, I don't know, Satan, the devil, the enemy, whatever name.
It's interesting, actually. You bring up the names. A detail that I've always found interesting is who Jesus calls the enemy here, called Satan. Actually is one of the few characters similar to God who is never given a name. Yeah. He actually doesn't have a name in the Bible. He's never given one. But this story is where we get Satan. Yes. Satan is the Hebrew word. It means adversary or even prosecutor. Yeah. It's a term that comes from court. And it's very interesting. Job is a Hebrew word that means persecuted. So there's a sort of a metaphor that comes up of like Job is sort of the defendant in like this court drama almost, because the Satan comes, and in Hebrew court, basically that role was you would kind of like what we say today as devil's advocate. Yeah. Like when you push the counter narrative, because essentially God was talking about there's this man who's so faithful and like he is a great man and I'm very proud of him and all of this, and everyone else is agreeing and being happy. And so then the role of the Satan from the court sort of precedent that name comes out of, that title comes out of, his role is to come and challenge that. And it's challenge and tempt. I'm trying to remember the word, but like, it's in the same word means tempt as means test. Yeah. And that's sort of why, like in an official capacity, he's testing the narrative by challenging it. And that's why they had this as an official position in court, because you don't want to assume that something's true and then be proven wrong later.
Yeah, exactly.
But then sort of the dark side of that is the tempting, trying to make things worse.
The whole thing that caught my attention though on the story is that I remember reading it and thinking like, wait a minute, Satan is currently in God's presence is what caught my attention. And so in the book, it literally describes that God is holding counsel and that Satan walks up, like he's already in the meeting.
He's there.
Yeah,
it's
so
not like he invades.
Like he's already included in the meeting among all of these people. Mm-hmm. And he just simply speaks up. So God again is talking about how amazing Job is and like he's incredible. I love him, favor him. And then Satan is basically like, I'm gonna stop you right there, Keith. And he's like, let me tell you why you favor him so much.
Think about Disney Hercules.
Yeah, let me tell you why you favor him so much. It's because you give him everything. Of course he's going to worship you. He worships you because he has everything. So in the book of Job, Job is, again, highly favored. So he's blessed. He has multiple children, a beautiful wife. He has sheep, all the cattle that he needs, so much land,
Richest in his area.
home. His kids have their own homes. Like everyone has their own plot of property. And so what Satan does is he tells him, like, the only reason Job loves you so much and honors you and is a godly man is because he's so blessed. If you took,
Basically, what does he have to be sad about?
yeah, like he's a happy man, he's rich, he's living his best life. And so what does he say? He's like, but I bet you if we were to strip him of everything that he has, he would stop worshiping you. Like he would not be faithful to you. How could he be faithful to you, to a God that allowed something like that to a good man to happen? And so it's very interesting because in this moment, God like they have like this agreement where Satan tells him, like, let me strip him of what he has and watch him no longer worship you. And God, being the omniscient, am I saying that? Omnipotent. Is that the word?
Means, like,
All knowing. Yeah. God being all knowing accepts. He's like, you know what? Fine. Like, strip him of everything he has, but don't touch his health. Like, take all the material things away. That's fine, but don't hurt him. You know, like his health. And when I say God being all knowing, is that he's aware what Satan's trying to do. You know, he's aware that he's trying to, like, of course, do the opposite of, I mean, just disagree with God. That seems to be his character over and over again, is the opposite. And so that council meeting is concluded because with God's permission, he is allowed to come near Job and strip him of everything. And this, of course, unfortunately, opens Job to the attacks from Satan. And he loses everything. Everything that I just named and numbered that he had, he loses it, down to his children. Like, he loses all of his kids. I think for some reason, I don't know why, but Satan kept his wife around. I'm thinking about it now, and I'm like, out of all the things, wouldn't you want to kill her too? Like, if you're taking everything away?
Goodness.
I mean, that's a bit of a spoiler, though, because the kids don't die until later, or do they die immediately?
The kids are one of the last things to go, I believe.
Okay, well, yeah, but still, like, his wife seems to be one of the main things
It's
that...
42 chapters long. I think there's like 20 chapters in which he's losing things.
Yeah. Well, with all of that being said, though, he starts off by taking materialistic things away from Job. He takes away his home, all of his cattle, all of his land. Everything goes up in fire. He doesn't just, like, the animals don't simply drop dead. They literally just, they go down in flames. Or one of the things that happens in the book is some of his workers were in a building and the building comes crashing down upon them. And only one survivor from each location is left alive so that they can run and tell Job of what happened. So, you know, his harvester comes running and he's like, everything, was destroyed. Everyone else died. I'm the only one alive. I'm coming to bear you these bad news. And so in the book, Job is getting back to back to back to back to back to back to bad news. It's kind of like in modern day time, like you get a flat tire, your car engine starts to go bad. There's something that goes wrong in your house. You need a new AC unit. You have a bad diagnosis. Like all of these things start happening to Job, and like he is just distraught. And of course, one of the last things that he is told is that his children and his children's children are dead. Like everyone is dead. Of course, like I said earlier, his wife is still alive. Don't know why. I think Satan just decided to leave his wife around. But so he goes into this place of he's lost everything. And in the culture back then is when you were truly distraught and going through it, you were to rip your clothes. Like it was a symbol of just angst. Like you were just in.
Yeah, kind of like a symbol of mourning.
Yes. Yeah, like you rip your clothes, and I believe you shave your beard too. Like your hair goes as well. And so Job falls to the ground, of course, and even so, he still worships the Lord, though. Like in those moments where he's lost everything materialistic in his family, he still worships the Lord and says, "God, you are good." Like he says, you're still a good God. You are a God full of wisdom, a graceful God. And he doesn't turn from God and curse him. And he doesn't, he doesn't question God in that moment. And so he continues to worship the Lord. And of course, there's another council meeting, and there's Satan again. And God is like, well, see, my son Job still remains a godly man, and he still, worships me. And so Satan says, yeah, but that's only because you left him his health. I bet if he got sick, he wouldn't worship you anymore. I bet if he got sick, he would curse you. I bet if he got sick, da-da-da-da-da. And so God tells him, all right, fine. From before he was like, don't touch his health. Now he's like, all right, fine. Like, you may hurt Job physically. And so
I think he says, but leave him his life.
Yeah, like leave him his life. I mean, yeah, but if Job died, like the game would be over. Mm-hmm. So that's a good point, though. Yeah, but he makes Job sick, and I'm talking about like not just like a common cold sick. I can't remember off at the top of my head what Job had, but Job.
I remember. I think it's like sores.
Yeah, he had like really big sores. He couldn't barely stand. Everything was painful. He couldn't sleep. It was so painful from the sores. And so the whole point of this is that Job hadn't done anything wrong. So Job is struggling trying to understand why he's being punished. In his eyes, because back in that culture,
talk about the language of like innocence, that he knows he's innocent.
Yeah.
And so he knows God will deliver him.
Sorry, I took that opportunity to take a sip of my Starbucks, so I was happy. No, I think that you're right. I think all of this, though, plays such an important part because the whole council meeting started with he only worships you because you give him everything, because he's so favored in your eyes, so strip him of everything. And even in these moments, Job refuses to curse God. Even his wife, which might be why Satan left her around, is he probably knew she would do this, but even his wife tells him, like, why don't you curse God and die? Like, give it up already. Like, God clearly doesn't care about us. Our children are dead. What do we have? We don't have anything. We've lost everything. Your health is, you're doing horrible. Just curse God and die. And Job refuses to curse God. He will not curse him. He won't. He just won't. And he's struggling with all of this loss that he's dealing with. And I don't know the timeline of how much time had passed when all of this happened, but the real question that is talked about theologically in multiple YouTube video conversations, small group conversations is God just? Does he run the world according to justice? Because what goes around comes around, right? But in biblically speaking, it's never been about you do wrong, I do wrong to you from God's eyes, or you do right and I do right to you. It's always just been bigger than that. And I will take this opportunity to say this now. I think about a year ago, I started thinking about how there's two forces at play, a good and a bad, in every situation, a light and darkness. And this is a perfect book to talk about that because God is holding a council meeting. He's talking about how much he favors Job, how proud he is of Job, how happy he is to have him. And Satan walks up and says, yeah, but I bet this. And so it's such a domino effect of...
The central question.
Yeah.
It's Job is, in terms of literature, what is called a wisdom book that is intended to... be read over and over and sort of meditated on. It's click. So a wisdom book has sort of a central thought or question, and that question is meant to be dwelled on and not even necessarily answered, because sometimes the point of it is to give you things to think about. And the central question of this, I would say, is one, how do we respond when bad things happen to us? That's sort of the question that's raised in that initial time when God's holding court. Yeah. And also, why do bad things happen? Yeah. Because then, and we're, I think, about to get to it, we get some answers proposed by human characters in the story.
And you know
because
what?
Job has some friends who come to visit him in his time of need.
Job needs to look over his Facebook friends.
And,
Once we get into it, Job needs to look over his Facebook
and
friends.
they are essentially representing the philosophies of the day, because one of them is essentially saying you need to confess. Whatever wrong thing you did that you're being punished for, you need to confess and get right.
Yeah.
Because that is one of the ways that people have answered that question for a long time.
Yeah. So let's do a really quick recap, because once we start talking about that, it's going to get very complex. Yeah. So let's do a real quick recap just to make sure that the listener... I swear. I'm sorry. I'm going to fill you guys in a little bit. We got Starbucks before we started recording, and we got iced drinks. So, of course, there's like clinging. And these mics have a mute button. You can like hit the mute button, take a sip of your drink. I don't know why, but instead of hitting mute and making his life easier, Martin just goes really far away from the mic and takes a drink when he could just hit the mute button, sip, jingle, jingle, and then unmute. But he just gets far, and it just, I don't know, I just think it's very interesting.
Lost in the scriptures.
Because you have the button.
And forgetting the worldly.
Like you have the ability to mute. Why not mute? You know?
I was with the Holy Spirit. I wasn't here physically. I was up in the court.
Uh-huh. I'm just saying, like, if you have the ability to mute, then you could drink freely, and you wouldn't have to worry about going.
I'm
so
sure
far,
I could.
Right? Well, back to the topic on hand. Yeah, to recap, Job is blameless, righteous, honors God. God presents him as a godly man. Satan, Hebrew word for Satan, accuser, prosecutor, challenges God, saying Job only comes because he's rewarded for being good. So this opens the domino effect where God says, all right, bet, take all of his stuff away. Satan says, say less, all the good stuff. So he goes, takes it. Job is distraught. His kids are dead, distraught. All of these things are happening. His wife tells him to curse God and die, which is marriage goals, I suppose. But
yeah, and just something I want to say really quick on the... I'm sorry, were you finished with your thought? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I didn't have a complete thought. I was just recapping. So you go ahead, because once we hit
I just wanted to say, on the topic of it being kind of like court, where essentially Satan, the Satan, and everyone else in the story, including the people who are about to be introduced, are the prosecution. You know, like they're prosecuting Job. Job is the defendant, and the one person who's defending him is God.
Yeah.
Like even his earthly, like his wife, his own wife, his friends, they are not on his side. The only one on his side, because he is righteous, because he is innocent.
Yeah.
The one who knows he's innocent is God. God knows the heart.
Yeah.
And like maybe Satan knows it too. Probably not.
I can't speak on that.
Only God
but
is all-knowing.
Yeah, so, yeah, with all of that, like, Job gets to such a low point. I mean, being sick, losing your children, losing everything, you can't even speak because of how much pain you are in.
It doesn't take much, honestly,
and
to throw you.
He still
and he
does not curse.
He lost everything.
So this is where we get into a little bit of a complex part of the book of Job. This will begin around chapter 3.
Becomes a philosophy class.
Yeah. And again, we're not going to try to overcomplicate it, but we want to simplify it as much as possible.
The panic in your eyes.
I know, because I immediately knew that you were going to start. Martin is going to be a fantastic tool. And like, he's like Clippy on Microsoft Word, where he's just going to have all of this really great insightful stuff. Meanwhile, I've got the simplest version. So, well, yeah, it came out like the insult, like he's such a tool, but I didn't mean it that way. I meant it as a compliment. Like, you're a multi-tool, you know? Like the little ones that got all the little things on them. The one that you're happy to have because you're like, oh, I actually have that attachment for that. That's what I meant. But yeah, so this is what happens. There is a group of friends that come to see Job. They come and they basically are having like not a get together, but they're visiting Job and they're trying to figure out what's happening. Job's argument is that he's innocent because they're like, what did you do? Like, what did you do to anchor God so much that you've got to this extent of pain and loss? And Job is like, I'm innocent. I haven't done a thing.
And this is still
to
an
my
attitude
knowledge, to my
that
heart.
a lot of people have
Yeah,
to this day. And it's sort of, it poses the question like we talk about karma. We talk about like basically divine retribution. You do bad things happen to you. You do good things happen to you. That's like what we today call the prosperity gospel. That's how churchy folk refer to it. There are some famous preachers who get very rich preaching this way because people like to hear it. If you pray once or twice a day, read your Bible once a month, then it's like you have a guarantee for riches. You'll be driving a Tesla next year because God loves you. And at the beginning of this book, it almost sounds like that's being confirmed because, Job is highly favored. He has a good life.
Like let's modernize Job nowadays. Like Job basically had a mansion. But no, he has an island and his kids are on that island. Everybody has a house, everybody has a Tesla, everybody has like solar panels. So yeah, you're right. Like the beginning of this book does start off of like, wow, like if you look good in the eyes of God, you will have it good. And I love that this book kind of breaks it down of like, not necessarily because you become a bigger target for Satan, because Satan wants you to question God's existence. He wants you to distrust God. He wants to make you feel like, I've done nothing but good. Why would God put me through this? And this also shows God's character because God allows it, but not to hurt Job, because he's defending Job. He's like, don't take his life. Don't hurt him. And he allows Satan to go up to an extent during all of this too. So it shows both Satan's character and God's character. God comes from a loving, caring perspective of I love him. Satan's like, I bet he wouldn't favor you. I bet he wouldn't care about you if you took everything away. And God's like, okay, let's put it and see what happens.
It's the sort of story that almost raises more questions than it answers in a way. Like it is pushing it, trying to answer some questions, but I think there are a lot of questions we can ask. And this is probably all your listeners know the word parable. It's a teaching style where you tell a story.
Not necessarily. Some listeners might not know what the word.
Well, that's fair.
So I would encourage you to.
It's the way that Jesus most liked to teach, and that's not a coincidence because it's a cultural factor that comes down through the generations. There were, basically teachers were storytellers in this time. If you want to make a point, you tell a story and you show that point through a story that people can relate to. And that's kind of what this wisdom book is for. And I think there are a lot of questions that come up. For example, I think it kind of points at a more complex world than what we imagine. Successful people are good and unsuccessful people are bad. I think we see this all the time.
I might be biased, but when people look at homeless people and say they need to get a job. It's like,
that's exactly what I was going to say. Like there's an assumption that people have what they deserve.
Yeah.
And I think this pushes back against that.
Yeah. I personally feel like we don't know that person's story. We don't know what led them up to this. Like a lot of the times it's not as simple as saying just get a job. You need an address for a job. If you're homeless, you don't have that. A lot of jobs require you to have a car. If you don't have that, you need to at least shower and look clean when you show up for an interview. And a lot of homeless people don't have that. So it's like knowing that there's more in the background than we realize. And so it's parables were great for that because it would, like even the Good Samaritan too, that was a great parable. But we won't get into all of that because... Yeah.
And it's even worth asking the question, did God give Job what he had in the first place? Or is living a righteous life, being that sort of person, does that just help too? I think this book brings up a lot of questions that it makes a point not to answer directly.
Yeah, I like that.
Because it says at the beginning that Job is successful, and it says that he's highly favored by God. But it never actually says that God gave him everything he has.
Yeah.
Like, I think...
He definitely was blessed. Like, of course, when he planted seeds, God probably was like, and we'll make sure that they sprout and everything. But,
I think
he had
also,
to physically go in and labor in that sun. It's not like he prayed for seeds and God provided them and said, actually, can you plant them in the soil for me? Like, he physically had to labor. And the harvest, of course, like God is the God of the earth and the water and the heavens. So, like, he made sure that it was a good harvest. You know, and as long as Job knew where to put the seeds, because if he just put them out in the middle of anywhere, I mean, with enough faith, I'm pretty sure the Lord would have been like, all right, fine, let's do it.
Yeah.
But it's about, like, you're right. Like, Job woke up. Job knew when was the best time to harvest. Even when, like, raising his children, I'm pretty sure he wasn't, like, a mean father. I'm sure he was a loving and caring father. So you're right. Like, character has so much to play with it too.
Especially when you look at the New Testament, like, blessings aren't always physical. I think, like, a lot of the passages that get brought out by the sort of, like, prosperity gospel preachers who want to talk about, like, if you're faithful, you'll get riches on earth. Like, a lot of those passages, if you actually go and read, like, it's saying you'll have riches stored up in heaven, or you'll have riches of joy, or of, like, development of your own internal life. Like, it's talking about more ethereal ideas than just your bank account will be full. Like, it's trying to get at something deeper, something more...
Letting go of stress.
More spiritual, more philosophical.
Yeah,
like it's not that simple.
Going from being extremely stressed to learning to kind of lean onto the Lord and being like, you know what, like I'm choosing not to stress about this, because I don't earn another day by stressing. I get wrinkles. Like, I lose my peace of mind. And like that's a really great way of putting it. It's not to say that God just handed all of this to Job and said, here you go. It's more of Job was just favored in the Lord's eyes. He was a good man. He was a good husband. He was a great father, and possibly a great employer too. You know, like, it seems like he had a lot of workers, had a lot of land. He needed a lot of help. So getting off of that and jumping into back to his friends coming. Yeah, again, his friends come, and back in that time, in that culture, you know, if you were getting punished, or at least it looked like it. Like, from everyone's perspective, Job is just going through it. So they believe you must have done something to anger God. You must have, like, really just done something horrible. And Job argument, like, while he's on the stand, basically, he's like, I haven't done anything. Like, I'm innocent. Like, I truly was a as close to righteous of a man that I could possibly be. I did sacrifices. I raised my children to, like, fear the Lord. Like, he was a good man. And the implication is that God runs the world according to justice. So you do wrong, you get wrong. But that's not true, because conclusion A would be God doesn't run the world according to justice. And God is not just unjust. You know, the friends are like, well, God is justice, so you must have done something wrong. And or because of that, you must have sinned. But there is a friend. His name is spelled EINV. He comes in. He's the one friend among all of the friends who is like, actually, I don't think you're right. He's like, I don't think that God is just, or God is about justice, about doing right and getting right, or doing wrong and getting wrong. God rules the world according to more than just justice. You know, God is, his existence is. And so suffering may be a warning to avoid future sin, because it builds character. So this friend comes in and talks more about how it's not about how God is punishing Job. And it's also not about that God is trying to balance something out that Job did. It's about God's true character and how he's like, God is, and that's Like he is, and what he's doing right now in this moment could be beyond our own understandings. This character goes into it could be that God is simply growing Job's character.
You bring up an interesting point. If I could add on to it, I think part of what he's saying is that the way I read that part, he's saying that there are a few things we know. One, that we can't question God, that he is what he is. And two, that if Job is telling the truth about being innocent of wrongdoing, that there must be a reason. And this is something that we come to in philosophy. They call this the problem of evil. And it's essentially that, like, why is there bad in the world? Why is there evil in the world if God is all powerful and all knowing? And surely he could have made things so there wasn't any bad.
And that's how he did initially.
And people come to different conclusions. A lot of the answers come from, if there's going to be free will, there's going to be evil, because you can't give people choices without letting them do bad things. And that doesn't necessarily explain like earthquakes and tornadoes and things, but it does go a long way to explaining why there's bad in the world. And another, that's sort of what this friend is bringing up in this book, and this is a popular belief to this day, is that basically going through bad things teaches us, that it helps us to grow. And I think that can be a satisfying answer for some and not for others. I think when we think through this, like, I personally don't believe that you need pain to know what joy feels like, which is something a lot of people say. Like, you wouldn't recognize happiness if you didn't have sadness, is a popular belief in philosophy. And I don't think that's necessarily true, but I definitely think we learn through our experiences. And that was a popular belief even back in this day, and that's part of what this friend's role in the story is to bring in another interpretation of what it means to suffer.
Yeah, he rose in saying, like, what's to say that Job had to have done something bad to receive what he's getting? I think we're missing the bigger picture. He walks in kind of being like, our God is a pretty big God, and he could be having more going on behind it, because God is, and underlined is, just. So it's more about God's character and not just you do wrong, you get wrong. And his conclusion is the best conclusion out of all of the friends, versus being like, you did something wrong, you get something wrong. And yeah, so like going into the book of Job, you kind of see Job really go through it. And he gets to a point in the book where he doesn't necessarily curse God, but what he ends up doing is cursing the day he was born. He talks about, like, curse the day that I ever came into this world. Like, he just ends up hating his life. Like, his friends have basically turned their backs on him. They see him as some kind of ungodly man who is getting severely punished, and he is just at his wit's end, and he is like, I'm over it. Like, I hate the day that I ever came on earth. I hate that I was ever born. Like he basically just lets his heart out to God and says, what the heck, like, why would you bring me here to cause me to suffer to this extent?
It's like It's a Wonderful Life, the Christmas movie.
Yeah. And he actually kind of like, he addresses God directly, and he tells him, like, I want an answer. Like, yeah. I want you to talk to me.
This is the one time he becomes sort of indignant.
Yeah.
At this point, like, he wants an explanation. Yeah. Still not to the point of, like, accusing necessarily.
More of, like, questioning. He questions God. That's the best way to put it. He just says, like, what the heck? Like, and I'm sure everyone listening can relate. I can, where I was like, I don't know why I'm here. Like, I'm so at my wit's end. And so Job is questioning God, and he tells him, like, talk to me. Like, you need to answer. Like, what the heck? And it talks about how God actually comes to talk to Job, but he comes as a big storm cloud. Like he comes and a storm cloud is formed, and God kind of takes Job on this visual tour. And imagine it's kind of like God is showing Job these images, and he's kind of breaking it down to him. He's telling him like the world is much more complex than you know. Like he's telling him, I created the heaven and the earth.
Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?
Yeah. So he's basically telling him like, you weren't there when I made the earth. You don't know to the extent that I've done it. And I mean, I always say science is an incredible place to look towards in this aspect, because molecules, atoms, like, and it gets smaller and smaller. Like there are still things that we don't know about, and God kind of shows that to Job and says,
able to observe.
Yeah, God shows that to Job and shows him like from every bird to every animal to every drop of water to every piece of dirt to every tree. Like I made all of this. Every molecule on this earth I've created. And so you can't possibly wrap your head around why I do the things that I do. Yeah. When you can barely wrap your head around the creation of the earth that you live on alone.
And I like the image he uses of laying the foundations. Because so that's obviously a term that comes from building. Buildings have foundations. And I think sometimes we think of that as just being like the floor. But it actually, so for a foundation, you dig. Yeah. And you dig very far down. Like when you think of a New York City skyscraper or something, there might be 7 floors worth that's just empty. It's just going down below the basement. And the reason you do that is because otherwise it'll tip over. Yeah. Or in a heavy rain, when the soil becomes wet, becomes muddy, the house will sink and shift like the Leaning Tower of Pisa did. Yeah. And I think it's a very nice metaphor for a spiritual understanding of the world and whatnot, that he laid the foundations, the parts that you can't see, that hold everything together.
I mean, I think
that's a very pretty
way of putting it is, I mean, hairstylist here, so I'll use myself as an example. As a hairstylist, and I know that if you're a hairstylist listening, I know you will understand, but it's having someone come in and say that they have box dye in their hair and they want to be platinum blonde and they want X, Y, and Z, and kind of having to explain to them the science behind it and kind of telling them no, or saying yes, but not now, kind of explaining to them that there's more. And so like in our industry, it's common to have clients who don't entirely understand why you're saying no. People believe that like, oh, isn't that simple as putting the color on my head, and won't my hair take the color? And the response to that is no, your hair will not take the color. You need to actually understand the science behind it. There's a whole reason we go to school and we get, like this whole course of training that we go through, even hair cutting, like your hair texture, like what kind of hair color you have, what kind of hair texture you have, the hair history, hormones, like everything that you're dealing with and everything that you've got going on in your hair and your hair cuticle plays a huge part during your appointment and during your consultation. So there's a bigger picture of it. So it's not as simple as sitting down and showing us a picture and being like, this is what I want. Like we have to determine whether it's possible and like whether your hair can handle it. Also, if you have ever had your hair like smoking in a foil or just struggle, like let's just say you went in and you got your hair in a foil and it started smoking or it got really hot, that's not your stylist's fault. I've heard people say like, my last stylist or YouTube videos talking bad about a stylist, but I'm gonna quickly just, while we're on the topic, that's not your stylist's fault. There are chemical reactions. So for example, your stylist could have had another girl get the same exact thing before you showed up an hour ago, leave happy, get the picture perfect hair done, exactly what they wanted. Then you came in. Now, depending on the shampoo that you're using in your hair, the type of box color you've had in the past, whether you're from somewhere with really hard water that has a lot of built up in it, could have a chemical reaction to the color that we're using. And that doesn't happen like a lot, like it's very rare, but it can happen. And so if your initial reaction is to say they messed up my hair when they have a pretty good track record. It could just be a chemical reaction in your hair. And so it's also understanding that there's so much at play in any career. An architect, you could show them like, this is the house I want. But if the plot of field that you bought does not offer a good foundation to build that house on, and it's not like a great spot, or the trees around, like it's just not doable, you can't just become upset with the architect and your contractor for telling you no. Like there's so much more. Like they went to school for it. They learned it. They know everything about it. So yeah, like even in my line, I feel like having to tell people why that might not be a great option, or even with as simple as bangs. If you have a very small forehead, bangs are probably not for you, because they're going to take way too much away from your frame, away from your face, and it's going to make your face look even smaller. If you have a larger sized forehead, then yeah, absolutely go for it. But like even that, this is just a little sidetracking of what the main topic of what we're talking about now is. There's so much we don't know and don't understand. And so this book is great at showing us that like God kind of steps in and says, wait a minute, like there's so much you don't understand. There's so much that has played a huge part in my creation of you and of this world, and from every water drop to tree and even your children, like everything. It's so complex. We learn more and more and more and more. I mean, even a DNA strand is extremely complex and can be ruled out in a courtroom, even if it's like matches perfectly. So that just goes to show that like God is much more complicated and complex than we could ever wrap our heads around. And in this book, God's response to Job is, you don't have a universal vantage point. And what does that look like? It's kind of like if you have a child and they get mad at you because you won't let them play with a particular object. Like let's say a battery. Let's say a toddler really wants to suck on a battery and you're like, no, because battery acid, but they don't know that. So they get mad at you when you take it away. That's because you have a bigger vantage point than they do. And so God has a much bigger vantage point than we do. That's like, I mean, it's kind of like when you get on a plane and you go up and then you'll get so humbled because you're like, oh my gosh, we are so small. Like, I mean, at least for me, when I'm on a plane and it's going higher up and I'm staring down because I love the window seat, and I'm like looking and I'm watching how the grass is actually turning into square shapes, and like sky buildings are getting smaller and smaller. And so then I start to feel like an ant. It's so easy to be like, oh my gosh, like I need to live my life a little more. I need to go skydiving. But that's not the point. The point is God sees it from that perspective, but yet he can see every single piece of dust and knows it by name. Now, I don't know if he's naming dust, but it's an example. I don't know. He might have like a category for them. But the point is, he talks about Job having a very limited perspective. Job has that taller perspective compared to God's perspective. And so God doesn't, in this book, God never tells Job, and this is why. He doesn't ever tell Job, like, actually, we had like this meeting and I was just saying like, you know, guys, Job is a whole vibe. Like he's chill. Like we like Job. And then that guy, Satan, came over and said, no. Let me tell you something. I bet if we took everything away from Job, he wouldn't worship you anymore. God omits all of this. God doesn't even bother to tell Job this because for whatever reason, he just doesn't seem fit to. Instead, he just tells him that there is a bigger perspective that Job doesn't understand, and that Job's perspective is limited. And that is such an interesting thing, because then God goes back up, not telling Job of any of this. And so Job never truly gets an answer on why. But he is humbled, and he's like, oh, I don't understand why God does the things that he does.
That brings up the question for me. I wonder, what is your main takeaway for this? Because obviously...
Also, I want to give a quick plug. A lot of the knowledge that I have from this is just from reading, but also, if you've never heard of it, there's this amazing YouTube channel called The Bible Project. They illustrate a lot of the Bible and make it into like, not cartoons, but they draw it and they animate it, these amazing animations, and it makes it easier to understand the Bible. So like a lot of the things I talked about today are notes that I've taken in the past from the book of Job. And so if you want to get even a bigger aspect and actually a little deeper into it, because we're just scratching the surface here. If you want to get a little deeper into it, I really, really suggest you checking out the Bible Project.
Yeah,
on
especially
YouTube.
if you're interested in like a sort of a pulled back literary approach
Yeah, they
to
will.
looking at it. I mean, they do very good, just like summaries. And
Yeah, they simplify it, but also like
then-
you get it, and you're like, wow, like that was fantastic.
Yeah, the main voice of them is Dr. Tim Mackey, who I forget if he's still teaching or not, but
I don't know.
he's
Let me check.
a professor.
He's a fantastic. Him and
Yeah, he studied
his
Hebrew
team are
and
incredible.
a bunch of other things, and
But you were asking me a question.
very good sort of scholarly approach to looking at these issues. I was asking you what, in the end, is your main takeaway from the book, because it opens with a bet,
Yeah.
essentially.
Well,
you know?
I'll answer both beginning and end if that's okay with you. Sure. So when I first read it, I just couldn't wrap my head around Satan being in the vicinity. I thought that he was never allowed to come back. And so that opened my eyes a little bit to like, there's an open communication, it seems, somewhere between, and like, of course, this is beyond our understanding. We just went over that. But I remember thinking like, wow, he was allowed to go to the meeting. So it opened my eyes to, there is always an opposing person. Like we are on, I always say this, like it's like being on a soccer field. I love soccer. I used to play it when I was growing up. And I think of it as you're on this field and you will do whatever it takes to stop the other team from making a goal or winning. And you'll either trash talk, you'll bump elbows, you'll do whatever you possibly can. And you have teammates who you play with. And I think that the spiritual world is very similar to that. Like this book opened my eyes to, there is God, but then there's also the enemy that will do anything to oppose us, to question both God and us, and to also pin one against the other. Even God will never turn his back on us. But the enemy wants us to turn ours on him. And of course, like the stuff of like, if God was so good, then why does this happen? And da, da, da. And so like all of these little whispers that you get of, if God truly loves you, then why are you still living paycheck by paycheck? And it's like, it's also about your stewardship too, and it's like, plays a pretty bigger picture. So to answer your question, for me personally, that opened my eyes of reminding myself of like, there is someone who does not has my best interest. There is someone who wants me to struggle, wants me to question God, wants me to curse God. Just like the whole goal was like, I bet he'll curse you if you take everything away.
Yeah, that's a sort of a practical interpretation. And you had a second.
Yes. My second one actually happened more recently. Mm-hmm. I remember, I think I've talked to you about this, but this happened more recently in the aspect of I made a joke. It wasn't like a bad joke, but I remember saying like, oh man, if I was God, I would have already like delete. I would have restarted, reset the computer. I would have been like, wipe it, try it again, popped out my eraser. No, I remember thinking like, if I was God, I would have started over by now. I just remember, I don't know if I felt, I don't want to say I felt heavy-hearted, but I just remember thinking like, we can be such a frustrating group of people. There's a lot of good in the world, but there's also so much negative and just things that I can't wrap my head around. And I just remember saying like in a passing joke, like, yeah, if I was God, I would have restarted it, deleted it, like wiped out the board and started again with a better utopia. But I remember that not even like a week later, God kind of spoke to my heart. I think I was like rereading Job, or I think I was watching a Bible Project video about Job. And when it came to the part about Job having a limited perspective, I truly felt God place on my heart like, I could delete, I could start over, but I worked way too hard for this. Like God just placed on my heart that like, I designed you guys with so much love. Like you don't even understand the amount of work that went into making the heaven and the earth and the wind and the animals and like everything that I've created, down to you, down to every single person, even to the worst person on this planet. I cannot turn my back to. I will not start over. I will fight and fight and fight and fight for my children, and kind of like why he sent Jesus to die on the cross for our sins, so that he could have that relationship with us. And so I felt God place in my heart, like I could do that. It would be very easy for me to do that, but I will not do that. I want my children, and you only get it from the limited perspective that Job gets it. I get it from the perspective of every grain of sand and from every cloud. And let me tell you, he humbled me, because I've never made that joke again. I've thought it.
That's a very beautiful word. It reminds me of one of my favorite artists is Cezanne. And
I was about to say, is it DJ Khaled?
What? Say again?
DJ Khaled.
Oh my goodness.
No. Is it not?
So Cezanne was an impressionist painter and was famous for being a bit of a perfectionist. And there are countless paintings that are currently hanging up that are unfinished or partly destroyed. Because as you were talking about that, I just remembered the impulse and how strong it can be sometimes for an artist. Like I will sometimes be writing something, or I know a lot of people who will paint and they'll be halfway through painting a canvas and you just get the impulse to like drive your fist through it, to just completely destroy it because you don't want anyone to see it. Oh, yeah. And yet, if you keep going, if you keep adding lines, if it keeps growing, sometimes those can be the most beautiful things, because like halfway through creation, something is at its worst. I
mean, I hate to put it this way, but I also mean this from a very loving standpoint. Babies, like little fetuses, babies, like when people show you the little, like, we're pregnant, and it's like a cute little black and white, and you're like I'm trying to make out where the head is.
They come out looking like a pink raisin.
Yeah, like, yeah. So it's like that. It's like if I'm not saying like if I were creating like a fake baby, if I was making like a little 3D printer baby and I was like watching the process of it, I'd be like, oh man, I should probably start over. Even in like styling, like I'd like, oh man, like I should probably, I don't know, this is looking questionable. But then you finish and you're like, oh, with the whole, it's like a puzzle piece. When the pieces are scattered, it's horrid. But when you put the pieces together, it's beautiful. And like, yeah, like when you see it from the perspective of halfway or even beginning and not seeing the bigger picture, it's so hard to see the beauty in it. And yeah. I mean, what's his name? Oh, we just went Van Gogh.
Van Gogh, yeah. Van
Gogh, like, unfortunately, he died never seeing the impact that he has had. Mm-hmm. But he only
sold one painting during his lifetime.
It's a beautiful example of like, although you may not see it now, like, I mean, so many people, their names grew more and more after their death. And it's like, don't wait until you die to see what the fruits that you can have, but also like live now knowing that is already there set for you, you know, like, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And one of the things that's been milling through my mind just now, you've been talking a lot about perspective, and that's sort of the thing that was getting me, because I think we often naturally look at this story through the perspective of Job. He's the main character. He's the human. He's sort of the stand-in for us to think of it through. But I think it's interesting when you look at it through God's perspective. In the story, essentially, he's challenged to this bet, this like court proceeding that they go through. And I guess when I was asking you about the main takeaway, I think I'm curious what we're supposed to make of that, of the challenge that was made, because when you boil it down to its essential thing, the challenge was, do good people screw up? You know? Because he was essentially saying, like, eventually he'll give up on you. And I think, what are we supposed to take away from that? Because I think the answer to that question is a lot of people would have. Like, it was a hard thing for him to go through. Yeah. And not every person goes through that. and comes out the other side. So I don't know. And I don't necessarily have a point to drive at with that. It's just an interest. Like I say, this book is meant to raise questions, and that's the question that comes up for me this time.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. I mean, it's incredible to look at and think, or to read and think. Sorry. The way that it squeaked when you took a sip. It's just interesting to think that, like, you're right. The whole goal here was just to say, like, he'll curse you. Like, he's got it good. As soon as he doesn't have it good, he's not going to worship you. He's not going to be a godly man. But I think it also sets an expectation for people who are, like, a follower of Jesus to kind of realize that, like, on our worst days, realizing that it's beyond our control. Yeah. On our worst days, that, like, in the end, when we pray, always ending the prayer with, and your will be done. Accepting that God's will is the final word in everything that goes on, and also accepting that it's beyond our own understanding. Because what we didn't talk about, now that I think about it, is we didn't talk about the end of Job.
We didn't. And can I make one more point about that before we do?
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, because part of why I bring up the central question asked by the adversary and answered by God, or defended by God, I should say. That central question of, when tested, will a righteous person fail? Mm-hmm. The Old Testament, at this point, this is, I believe, the 18th book in the Jewish tradition. It comes after Genesis and Exodus and all of those stories about, like, the nation of Israel coming about, and some of their history, the judges and the kings and all of that. And up until now, when you look at that, like, God level perspective, when you're looking at it from, like, long time periods, that is the central question of the Old Testament, of the Torah and the Pentateuch and the other books. The central question being, like, can people be righteous? Because every time that some great figure rises up, what we see is they do great things, they show great faith, and then they fail, and then they fall. Abraham and Noah and Isaac, all of them rise up, and then they fall. Noah, after the flood, one of the first things he does is plant a garden. And in that garden, he grows grapes and he makes wines, and he becomes a drunk, essentially. He gets far too drunk and does dishonorable things.
David and Bathsheba.
And that's the end of his story. After, like, the part that we remember, the part that
yeah, even Moses too, because Moses never gets to go to the promised
Steve Carell
land.
acted out in a movie. After, like, what we remember about Noah, the end
even
cap
Solomon
on his story.
too, with his wisdom.
Mm-hmm. The end cap on his story is that he fails, and the same thing happens with David. The thing that made your jaw drop, like, he ends up sinning, and I won't spoil that because it'll come in a future podcast. But he ends up sinning in a rather major way.
I mean, sin is done in a major way.
So I think it's interesting, especially because of what I said at the beginning, that in the initial framing of this story, Job is positioned as an outsider. He's not even an Israelite.
He's not?
No, he does. Because he's from the land of Uz.
Well, no, I get that, but I mean more of, like,
he's a far off person. He's not from Israel.
What's his, like, where is he from?
Uz, spelled U-Z.
I don't remember. Right. You did say that.
It's a far off place. I can't remember exactly where it is.
I just didn't know if you were saying
day.
that he didn't live in Israel, but he was an Israelite. But
yeah, it's not fully clarified. The implication is that he's from Uz, but I don't think it ever gives us an answer on.
Yeah, it goes deep into the council.
Like I say, it has a slightly folkloric or fairy tale style in which detail is usually kept fairly minimal.
But the hit what you said a second ago. You said like the question was like, can anyone be righteous? And like, as I'm sure we all
has
know,
been no. Historically. I'm sorry, were you going to say that?
no, not at all. I don't even know.
Very sorry.
No, I was gonna say, answering what you were saying, like, yes, the answer is no. But also talking about why Jesus is so important in the bigger picture is because he was the only one who came, and he was the only one who was righteous, and he is the only one who, to answer that question, the only biblical character who was ever righteous, and to this day died being righteous and made his sacrifice so big. And so, yeah, like, very true on hitting all of that. And so getting closer to the end of the chapter, we find that after Job has his meeting with God and they have their conversation, and God goes back, it then talks about how Job actually gets 3 times what he had in the beginning. He ends up having more cattle, more property, more of everything than he did before. And it never says why. It's more as seen as a gift from God to Job on what he gave him. And it's not even said like, oh, because, you never cursed me. It's not even talked about in that aspect. It's God restores. No, and it's not triple, it's double. So God restores double everything. And he wasn't punishing Job. If anything, he kind of gives it back. But we don't know why. And we just know that Job now understands that no matter what, he is to trust God's wisdom in the end. He is to accept that God is all-knowing, and that that there's more than what he can see to the eye and his perspective, and he just has limited perspective. So now that he has double everything, and everything's, I mean, he's been given everything back as a gift. Or well, it's not said that in the book, but it's more of seen that way. He just sits differently. Like Job in the beginning and Job at the end is very different, because at the end he understands that everything that is beyond his own understanding.
Yeah. I think it can be a challenge to appreciate. I think the more that we get, the more inclined we are to think we deserve it. That's something that's been shown. Psychologists today call that the rich man's fallacy.
But it's also the culture that's been set for nowadays too.
It is. But I don't know. I think it's always been a part of us.
It has, but now it's been highlighted. It's been more of the front piece of everything. Yeah. If you think about it, it's always been there.
Yeah,
but it's been hidden in the past.
Yeah, culture, especially. Well, I don't know if it's maybe especially Western culture. I think there's a big focus on accomplishment. Like you do this and prove your worth. I mean, that's probably all people.
No, but see, I want to, while you're on that topic, I do want to hit on that. And it's not, I mean, there's nothing wrong from celebrating your accomplishments. Absolutely celebrate where you are. But it's so important to know that, like,
it doesn't prove
you are already worth it.
Yes.
You hitting a certain pay salary is not going to say, and now you are finally worth it. Yeah. You getting the car, or you buying the house, or you getting married, or you simply getting the job of your dream job. Like you, from the moment that you came into this world, you were already worth it. You were good to go. Kind of, and I'm sure parents out there will understand. When you look at your child, you love them. They are perfect in your eyes. There is no amount of money in this world that can buy your child from you. You love them how they are. You are happy with them, and you want them to know that they are perfect in your eyes. And the same is applied. Like, fantastic if you've reached those milestones. It's amazing that you have, but it's so much more important to know that your value does not lie within your accomplishments, because it's you who got to those accomplishments. You already had it in you. You just had to reach that set goal, but you already had it in you to do so. It just took time and effort, but you already were there. So yeah, celebrate your accomplishments. That's fantastic. Everything that you do is amazing, but don't lose sight of that in the eyes of God, He loved you, and it says like he knew you in the womb. He knows who you are. He loves you, like from the moment that you stepped out and you became of the world. Like God loved you right where you are. There is nothing that you had to do. There is no amount of praying or Bible reading or any of that stuff that brings you closer to God. God already favored you. God already loves you. It's the culture nowadays that says like, unless you're dressed like this or that, kind of like going back to the homeless, like, oh, they'd only get a job. They probably had a fantastic job, became bankrupt, lost everything, and are currently going through their Job phase. Where a righteous, loving, well, not fully righteous, but like a godly man, godly woman, lost everything. So we don't really know from their perspective, but always making sure that like your heart aligns with God's heart and knowing that you are already loved. And if you get the promotion, fantastic. But if you don't, you are still the same person you would be if you got the promotion. Nothing changes but the job title. So whether you're in a valley or in the in-between plains or at the peak of the mountain, what changes is your circumstances, but not you. You is what remains. Job is what remained. The character that God was speaking about during the council meeting was the character of Job. He wasn't saying, oh, Job has like all of these houses. He's got like 5,000 employees who've got a 401k, an insurance plan, an Aflac, and his wife has given him all of these kids. No, God was talking about Job's character when he was talking about him. And that's the same that applies for us. When we are seen in the eyes of God, he's not like, oh, and she's got like this incredible promotion. She's got like this amazing husband and all of these. No. God's like, she's got a beautiful heart. And that's what I'm after.
I think one of the hardest questions that we can answer about ourselves is how we define who we are, like for ourselves. Because I think about things like I love to write. I love to write nonfiction stories and all sorts of stuff. I always have. But I was thinking to myself, like, people can get injured or take a hit to the head. And if the language center of your brain gets damaged, you may never string a sentence together again. And I just remember I was in the shower where these sorts of thoughts thrive.
You get the weirdest thoughts in the showers.
I was in the shower and I was just thinking about that. And like, if that happened to me today, what would I think of myself when I woke up tomorrow? If I define myself as a person who writes well, a person who's good with words, like if that is the core of how I define myself, then I don't feel good tomorrow. If my definition of myself is deeper than just something I do well, if my definition of myself is deeper than just like one facet of my being, then I will survive things like that. Like I will be able to have a self.
Allow me to go in the opposite direction. Like I love what you're saying. So this is what caused me to go in the opposite direction. I am currently reading a book.
I love what you're saying. However.
No. But this is what I'm saying. It's great because what you're saying fits onto what I'm about to say is I've currently been reading a book called Embracing Obscurity, and it's a book about being anonymous, you know, taking away the luxury of being all of this in a bag of chips, basically. And going off of what you're saying, in that book, the author talks about embracing obscurity and no longer going by subtitles, not just saying like, hi, I'm Martin and I'm a writer, but more going into the aspect of I'm Martin and that's who you are. Not saying, hello, like I'm so-and-so and I have this job. I'm the CEO of this company, because you're kind of using this title to add value. Why are you introducing this into the conversation? Yeah. So off of what you're saying, that's what I'm saying. It's like, I like what you're saying because it hits the topic of the book that I've been reading, which I really like. It really encourages you to put aside your accomplishments, put aside your job title, put aside everything, and just be who you are inside, and stop trying to fit a mold that you're currently in, but more going over everything and just saying like, I'm Emily, how are you? And getting people to know you in that aspect instead of saying like, oh yeah, and I, do this and I do that. And it's great. Like, again, your accomplishments are great, but I really like that this book encourages for you to put the subtitles down, because while you're reading the book, it actually challenges you, and it says like what subtitles have you used and have you held on to?
Yeah. If you define yourself by anything that can be lost, then your identity is in danger at all times. Because, I don't know, like...
The best way that I can put it is, and sorry, I like a mango dragon fruit, whatever thing in my back of my throat. But if you're a parent, I know that you can relate to this. The moment that your child comes home from school or daycare and suddenly likes something that they didn't like before, or does something that they didn't do before because it was introduced to them, whether it's a funny word or a cartoon character, like there's a shift that they've added onto their personality that they didn't have before. That's something that's been introduced to them, or they're asking you about because so-and-so likes it, and it's getting caught up in the crowd, you know? And I don't remember who said it. I think it was this child, I don't want to say therapist, but like someone who has a lot of knowledge about children and their development, said that at some point your kids go from your voice to their peers being the loudest voice to them. So like from the ages of 12 and on, like what their peers do and say becomes the loudest voice, and your voice becomes the backseat voice. It's not as loud, it's not as prominent, it's not what sets the tone, but what everyone else is doing. Like, you know, I mean, for example, Uggs. I hate to admit it, but I had a pair, and now I look back and those are the ugliest things I've ever seen in my life. No hate against Uggs, but they just look like a little stump, like a little, do you know what I'm saying? I have nothing against Uggs. If you own a pair of Uggs, great. I'm just saying, like, back in my high school days, Uggs were the thing. Like, walking around in Uggs were great. And it's like that, it's so weird that like we follow the tone that's set by everyone else in these subtitles, and this is what I have and this is why I'm successful. But you're successful because of just simply who you are. You already had the capability of doing that. And with all of that being said, going ahead and wrapping up this book of Job, all of that to say, Job was blameless, righteous, and honors God. And in the end, God honors Job's struggle, Job's honesty, and Job's prayer. It was all about how Job seeked God. It was all about how Job was honest. He was innocent. He said, I didn't do anything. And he said to God, like, I cursed the day I was born. His honesty, his rawness. God could handle Job's pain. So the fact that Job ran to God and brought him his sorrow and his pain, like, that's what God honored. And God honored his struggle. So while in the beginning, again, like, Job was blameless and righteous and was a God-honoring man, in the end, that all of those things God loved, but he also loved his struggle, his honesty, and his prayer. And hopefully this episode has helped you understand the book of Job. I do encourage you to go back in, and if you have the Bible app, you can even listen to it audibly. Go to the Bible Project on YouTube and listen or watch. Like, they have like 3 minutes to 8 minute videos. It's not like 50 minutes. It's a very quick video where they break down the story of Job. Or even open your Bible and like read one verse or one chapter and kind of see that and see what jumps out to you, because we only scratch the surface. When you read into it, it'll be easier to read, and you'll be able to like take a note of something that we probably didn't discuss.
Yeah, I would definitely, especially if you're someone who like hasn't really cracked the Bible before. For you, it was something that people forced on you that you don't see in this sort of like interesting or literary way. I would recommend listening to it in audio, and definitely starting with a book like Job or Esther, which is right before it, or one of these other books that is a story. Yeah. And it was meant to be heard as a story, and you're meant to think about what these characters are going through and ask yourself constantly, like, what would I do? And what does that mean? What does that say? Maybe you agree with the character or maybe you don't.
It's all about the relatability on here. It's all about the rawness of these biblical characters were real people, and their stories got written down, and they normally we have a tendency of making them fictional, and we have a tendency of making them putting them high up like we could never be like so and so, but realistically we could be like Job, struggling and questioning God. And so kind of not putting them so high up on a pedestal, but realizing that these people and characters and these stories are real and they happened. So yeah, read it like the poems that they are and the songs that they are and the stories that they are, not forgetting that like the God that they speak to, the God that they are praying to, the God that they are worshiping, the God that they're lamenting to is the same God that we worship today. And his character remains true from the beginning and the end. So as we wrap this up, I truly encourage you to seek God out and welcome him into your pain, welcome him into your struggles, because as the theme of this podcast continues to grow, what God can do with your pain is incredible. There is no limit to what God can do. And I hope that in the previous interviews that you've already listened to, in the previous stories that you've already listened to of days that are, of people who are alive now, of people who have been willing to let me step into their lives so that we can all hear about the things that God has done in their lives, encourages you to welcome God into your life and to bring you closer to God and to spend time with him, and not necessarily reading your Bible every day or going to church all the time and like feeling like you have to get your life together to get close to God, but you are already there. It goes back to, it's not about once you get the promotion. It's about you are still that same person now and even then. So I encourage you to try reading the book of Job or watch a Bible Project video or even listening to it audio, like all amazing options. And again, like as we wrap this up, I thank you so much for joining me and Martin as we talked about the book of Job. Hopefully this made it easier for you to look into and to read. But most importantly, I just hope this encouraged you to welcome God into your life, because I always like to say our God is a God of consent. He is a God who doesn't want to burst in and break down your walls and say like, you will worship me and you will love me, but more of a, I'm here if you need me. And when you do need me, I am more than happy to step into this space with you and be with you. So I just really encourage you to seek God and do with all of this information that you will. With that being said, Martin, do you have anything to say before we finish?
Yeah. I think for me, there are two big takeaways from this book. And that's one that just, no matter what's taken away from you, you aren't broken. You aren't gone. Speaking as someone who's struggled a lot with depression, with problems of self-hate, and just some very serious anxiety, I think it's very easy for us to go through losses, especially losses to how we define ourselves, and to let that shake everything. And so I think as Job goes through all of this and he doesn't turn away from God, and that he doesn't turn away from that part of who he is, from that defining part of who he is, I think to me that speaks to like the desire to keep going, the desire to keep on living. And I think it can be so hard. I think finding a core for yourself that is unshakable is a very hard thing to do, but it's something that we can pursue through approaching these sorts of things, these sorts of issues, and thinking about them and really asking ourselves, like, what is the core of me? And two, just with this being your first sort of Bible book club that you're doing, I think a big takeaway could be that there are things like this to explore, that this book is not dead, you know? Like it's not a math textbook or something, like the way that people sort of, I think we treat it like it's some big scary physics textbook that we have to write a report on. And like, it's not that way at all. Like it's a story with characters and with themes and with all of this. I mean, there's poems and songs and all this like very lively text with a whole culture recorded in it, multiple cultures, in fact, as it spans the years. And there's just so much life. Even speaking like historically, there's just so much to be found in it. And I think that would be my main takeaway for the listeners to hear, is just there's something fascinating for you to find in the Bible. And like, if you don't find it in the first place you look somewhere else. And don't necessarily think you know what you're going to find. Yeah, that would be my message.
I think I do, to add on to that, it's whatever your upbringing may be, whether you grew up in the church, whether you grew up with no belief, whether you did grow up in religion but not relationship, whatever your experience has been, and if you've had a bad experience, I do encourage you. I'm sure we've all ordered a cup of coffee and we're not a fan of it, or we've all ordered a burger and it fell short of our expectation or what we liked. And so if you've had a bad taste of the Bible in your mouth, I really truly encourage you to, one, whether it's connected to a bad memory because someone was forcing you, or you grew up in a household that was really strict and religious but not relational, then I really ask you to, for a second, like, not asking you to erase those memories, because of course my podcast that that God has placed on my heart is all about seeing the pain and remembering that pain, and also seeing what God can do with it. But I do encourage you to, for a second, kind of separate that memory from the Bible, because the Bible did not get up on 2 little feet and 2 arms and slap you across the face. But it is a book with God's living word. So I do encourage you to see it from a new perspective. Look at it from, this is a different coffee house or coffee shop. This is a different salon. This is a different restaurant. Yeah, that's Give it the opportunity to be a different experience. You're no longer in that household, or you're no longer under that expectation, but open it more in as a storybook, as a relational book, not as much as the book that came up with the 10 Commandments, but more of a book where many suffer and many have gone through it, but God has shown up. And start with the book of Job if you can, if this podcast has made it or this episode has made it easier for you to listen. I mean, not listen, but read it. Or I truly encourage you to find sources like the Bible Project, or read a verse a day, but not to see it as I have to be the perfect example of what this book is giving me, because if not, then I'm not accepted. I've already fallen short. I've already messed up. Not necessarily, because this book has so many people who do fall short, and God's character is still loving them regardless of that situation. And so I really do encourage you to, whatever the bad experience or bad taste that it has left on your, on your palate in the past, I encourage you to just try it again. We all grew up loving chicken tenders and chicken nuggets, and we all ordered it off of the menu every time until we finally got the ability to pick something off the menu and realized that that vegetable that we hated for so long, turns out that it actually is really good when it's properly seasoned and cooked well, or included in a particular way. So the same can be said about the Bible. I really do encourage you to just pick it up, or even look at little snippets of the Bible Project where they do break it up softly, and then maybe then be like, oh, I wonder how I would perceive it if I read it. Yeah.
And I would say, with no other book do we make the assumption, just because someone reads a book, it doesn't mean they understood it. If someone, and I want to say this, if someone has said to you that, if someone has hurt you in the name of this book, or if someone has hated you in the name of this book, they did not understand this book. People have saved lives in the name of this book, and people have killed in its name. And it's not for us to say who's right. Yeah. But I don't think...
All we can speak of is the character of Jesus. And if you truly pay attention to the book, Jesus calls us to be loving and caring and not judgmental. He was very strong on, don't talk about the splinter in that person's eye when you have a whole log, a whole plank in your own eye. Like, he was so quick to say, like, don't you start talking when you yourself have your own things you're struggling with. Like, the expectation that Jesus left was love, kindness and love. And so in the past, if you have not experienced love and kindness by someone who walked around with the Bible, I am truly sorry that because of someone's own expectation, because of someone's, like, just, I don't know, misinterpretation of the word, don't allow that to speak for the Bible itself. Because I'll say it again, if you've gotten bad customer service at a place, that does not speak on the place itself. You know, it could be that that person was having a very difficult day, or exhausted, or just did not have the attitude for it. Because you could go to that same place with someone else, and that person would be like, oh my gosh, how are you? How can I help you? And we'll do whatever it takes. So I just encourage you to give it a try whenever you are ready, though. This is not go out there and do it right now, but this is just to open your heart to it, but not for you to feel like you immediately have to run and open up the Bible. This is something that is for your own relationship with God, and for it to fit your own time when you are comfortable, when you are ready. Even if you do not pick up the Bible, God loves you regardless. He is willing to meet you where you are. The Bible is just an incredible source to get to know God's character a little bit more, because when you read it directly, you see his character versus having someone else tell you his character from their perspective.
Yeah. Books are meant to be experienced, and they're meant to be interpreted as well. Like, it's, if you read something as cold and clinical, you won't get anything from it. I think it's worth, like, when you read a book, you sort of take ownership of it in a way. Like, you have your own things that you take away that no one else had. And the Bible should be that way too. Like, it belongs to anyone who reads it. It really comes alive in you.
Yeah.
And some people have interpretations that are dangerous or hurtful.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know, it's sort of like when I was a kid, I really loved Sherlock Holmes, and I read those stories over and over. And if a friend of mine came and said, like, oh, I've read those books too, I have some interesting interpretations, I'd be like, oh, how very nice. And if they said, like, I think Sherlock is a symbol for industrialization, then I'd be like, I don't know if I see that, but that's interesting.
Yeah.
But then if they told me, I think that the meaning of Sherlock Holmes is that I'm supposed to go out and stab the next 5 people I see, then I would say, go to prison, sir. Like, that would be, I don't know. People have read the Bible and taken away some wild things.
Yeah.
I don't think my metaphor carried that very well.
Everyone's very, no, I can see that. Like, when you read a book and you meet someone who's read it too, and you both say something, and you realize that you both saw it from a different perspective, or you both, one loved one character, but the other hated that character. Everyone's so different. So it's a perfect example of, like, depending on the person and where their heart is, they can receive the message differently, and, like, it's received differently. So all of this to the conclusion to say, we just encourage you to not hold your past experiences against the Bible if someone has hurt you through it. If someone who carried the Bible hurt you using words that they've read in the Bible, I just encourage you to change that experience, change that memory, create a new memory with something better, something kinder, and not allow that to be the end of your experience with it. Not by someone else's hand, at least. Allow God to show you a different perspective. But with all of that being said, we have gone an incredibly long time. I mean, realistically speaking, I could talk all day when it comes to God's character and God's love and everything. So I guess creating a podcast for it has allowed me a little bit of an outlet. But yeah, I thank you so much for jumping in and listening to Martin and me just chit chat about the book of Job. I truly do hope this has made it easier for you. I thank you, Martin, for jumping onto this podcast with me in this episode. Hopefully we can create more episodes with more books, more stories, and more breakdowns.
That would be wonderful.
It would be. But to that, we are going to go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much for listening to What God Has Done With My Pain. As always, a huge shout out to Lazuli for her song No Greater Love that has helped make this podcast come to life. You can find her on Spotify and Instagram at Lazuli PROJ and at We The New Breed, where you'll find artists using their gifts to glorify God. Swing by at What Way This Way on Instagram to catch some behind the scenes snippets. Make sure to follow the podcast so you don't miss a single interview. In the meantime, I would love to hear from you on social media or email. Until the next episode.